Hello there, fellow insomniac. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we dive deep into the most mundane details of yesteryear until your eyelids grow heavy with the weight of centuries past. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring medieval hygiene, a topic so pungent, so deliciously revolting, that I promise your dreams will be perfumed with the essence of historical filth. Settle in, dim your lights, and prepare to be simultaneously disgusted and lulled to sleep. You might think you know what dirty means. Perhaps you've gone camping for 3 days without a shower, or you've experienced the particular bouquet of a teenage boy's bedroom after basketball practice. But my dear listener, you have no idea. Medieval filth was an art form, a lifestyle, a complex cultural phenomenon that would make your most unwashed moments seem like a surgical scrub by comparison. Let's begin where all good hygiene stories should, at the beginning. The early medieval period, that murky time after Rome fell and before castles got really pointy, had a surprisingly nuanced relationship with cleanliness. Now I want you to close your eyes, not because the details are too horrific, though they are, but because we're trying to get you to sleep here. Contrary to popular belief, early medieval Europeans didn't reject bathing outright. The Roman tradition of public bathhouses continued in many areas, particularly in places where Roman influence remained strong. Imagine yourself in 6th century Gaul. The grand Roman structures are crumbling around you, but the concept of the communal bath persists as a shadow of its former glory. People gathered, disrobed without our modern prudishness, and submerged themselves in water of questionable clarity. Charlemagne, that towering figure of early medieval Europe, was reportedly fond of bathing. The man who united much of Western Europe enjoyed swimming and soaking in the natural hot springs at Aachen. He even encouraged his courtiers and nobles to join him, creating a court culture where bathing was associated with the elite. Picture, if you will, the Emperor of the Franks, his long beard floating on the surface of steaming mineral waters, discussing matters of state while essentially naked. Politics has certainly become less interesting in the intervening centuries. Monasteries, those bastions of medieval learning and spiritual discipline, maintained bathing traditions as well. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, even prescribed regular bathing for monks, though regular here means something quite different from our daily showers. Benedict suggested that healthy monks should bathe seldom, which historians interpret as somewhere between seasonally and when the smell becomes a theological issue. But here's where our story takes its first malodorous turn. As the early Middle Ages progressed into the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, attitudes toward bathing began to shift dramatically. The public bathhouse, once a center of civic life, fell under increasing suspicion. Why? Well, there's nothing quite like a good plague to ruin a perfectly nice bathing tradition. Medical theory of the time held that water, especially hot water, opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to illness. The humoral theory of medicine, inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, suggested that disease spread through foul air miasma that could enter the body through these open pores. When epidemics swept through Europe, bathhouses were often identified as hotspots of contagion, and they weren't entirely wrong. Sharing bath water with dozens of strangers in an era before water sanitation was indeed an excellent way to share much more than just pleasant conversation. Additionally, bathhouses had developed a reputation as places of moral looseness. Many doubled as brothels or places where the sexes mingled with insufficient supervision by medieval standards. The church, increasingly powerful in dictating social norms, began to view public bathing with suspicion, connecting physical nakedness with moral corruption. The body, with its troublesome desires and fluids, was something to be controlled and concealed, not celebrated in steamy public gatherings. By the late Middle Ages, the pendulum had swung dramatically. Medical treatises warned against frequent immersion in water. The 13th century physician, Aldebrandin of Siena, advised that baths harm the lungs and weaken the body. recommendations that sound bizarre to our modern ears, but made perfect sense within the medical framework of the time. Now let's pause here to address a persistent myth: the idea that medieval people were universally filthy and never bathed. This simply isn't true, and the reality is far more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting. What changed wasn't whether people cleaned themselves, but how they did it, and what clean actually meant. As public bathhouses declined, private bathing became more common among those who could afford it. Nobility might have wooden tubs brought to their chambers, lined with cloths, and filled bucket by bucket with heated water. This was an enormous undertaking, requiring servants to haul and heat dozens of buckets of water, a luxury that displayed both wealth and status. Imagine the logistics: water drawn from a well or river, heated over a fire, carried upstairs, all for a bath that would last perhaps an hour before the water cooled in the unheated castle rooms. For the medieval noble, this bathing ritual might occur a few times a year, or before special occasions like weddings. Some households maintained designated bathing rooms, though these were far from our modern bathrooms with their gleaming fixtures and instant hot water. Picture instead a sparsely furnished chamber, perhaps with a wooden tub and a fireplace, where the arduously prepared bath would steam invitingly before growing cold all too quickly. But what of the common people, the vast majority who couldn't command servants to prepare elaborate baths? Were they simply unwashed? Again, the reality defies our simple stereotypes. Peasants and townspeople did clean themselves, albeit differently than we might today. Rivers, streams, and communal village fountains provided opportunities for basic washing. In summer months, outdoor bathing was not uncommon, combining practicality with the simple pleasure of cooling off. However, full-body immersion became increasingly rare as the Middle Ages progressed. This wasn't just due to medical fears or religious prudishness, it was also profoundly impractical. Heating water required fuel, a precious resource for people who needed their firewood primarily for cooking and staying warm. The effort involved in preparing a proper bath made it an occasional, rather than daily, occurrence for most people. This brings us to one of the central shifts in medieval hygiene, the evolution from water-based cleanliness to what we might call dry cleaning. As immersive bathing declined, the importance of linen undergarments rose correspondingly. Clean linen, worn next to the skin, and changed with varying frequency depending on one's wealth and status, became the primary interface between the body and the outer clothing. The theory, and it wasn't entirely unsound, was that the linen would absorb the body's impurities, oils, and odors. Changing into fresh linen constituted a form of cleaning oneself without the dangers and impracticalities of full bathing. The outer garments, made of wool or more expensive fabrics, were rarely washed, as washing technology of the time was harsh on fabrics and colors. Instead, they were brushed, aired, and spot cleaned as needed. This linen-based approach to hygiene created a curious paradox. A person might go months without fully immersing in water, yet still consider themselves, and be considered by others, as perfectly clean. The visual and tactile markers of cleanliness shifted from the skin itself to the garments touching it. The concept of cleanliness also took on powerful spiritual dimensions. Physical washing became increasingly linked with moral purification, baptism being the most obvious connection. But this spiritual cleanliness didn't necessarily require literal washing. A pure heart and soul became more important than an immaculately scrubbed body. This isn't to say that filth was celebrated, far from it. Even the most ascetic saints, renowned for their rejection of bodily comforts, maintained basic hygiene as part of their care for God's creation, their bodies, while simultaneously denying themselves the pleasure of luxurious bathing. The relationship between spiritual and physical cleanliness is beautifully illustrated in the practice of ritual hand-washing before meals, which persisted throughout the Middle Ages. This wasn't primarily about removing dirt. It was a symbolic act that marked the transition to the communal, civilized activity of dining. Clean hands signaled participation in the social order, regardless of whether other parts of the body had seen water recently. By the later Middle Ages, around the 14th and 15th centuries, bathing had developed complex social codes. Bathing became something done primarily for pleasure or healing in mineral bath, rather than routine cleanliness. Public bathhouses still existed, particularly in German-speaking regions, but they were highly regulated spaces with strict gender separation and behavioral codes, a far cry from the relatively relaxed Roman model. For the wealthy, bathing became an increasingly private affair. Illustrations from 15th century manuscripts show elaborate bathing scenes, wooden tubs with canopies for warmth and privacy, servants bringing refreshments, musicians playing soothing melodies. Bathing transformed from a mundane activity into a sensory experience, a luxury, an occasion. Meanwhile, the less affluent developed their own hygiene routines centered around the sponge bath approach, washing key areas like the face, hands, and, when necessary, genitals, while leaving the rest of the body to the mercies of linen undergarments. The face and hands, being visible, received the most attention. After all, cleanliness was increasingly about appearance and social conformity, rather than bacteria, which wouldn't be discovered for centuries. As we drift toward the end of this first segment, it's worth reflecting on how profoundly different medieval concepts of cleanliness were from our own. We, with our daily showers and antibacterial everything, would find medieval standards appalling, yet they would likely find our obsession with washing equally bizarre, a waste of resources and potentially dangerous to health. The most important thing to understand about medieval hygiene is that it wasn't simply worse than ours. It was operating under an entirely different set of assumptions about the body, health, propriety, and practicality. Their world smelled differently, felt differently, and conceptualized cleanliness through a lens we can barely comprehend from our position of indoor plumbing and instant hot water. As the medieval period progressed toward the Renaissance, new ideas about cleanliness would emerge, influenced by contact with Eastern cultures through trade and the Crusades. But those changes were gradual, almost imperceptible to the people living through them. For most of the medieval period, the dominant trend was clear: from water to linen, from public to private, from physical washing to spiritual purity. The next time you step into your shower, turning a simple handle to summon hot water as if by magic, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They navigated their world with different tools and different standards, yet with the same human desire for comfort and dignity. Their solutions to the universal human problem of bodily maintenance were ingenious, practical, and entirely of their time. Now, let's sink deeper into the daily routines of medieval hygiene, exploring the intimate details of how people actually kept themselves presentable in a world without plumbing, where water itself was viewed with suspicion. As we continue, I invite you to let your mind wander through these medieval hygiene chambers, where the rituals of cleanliness took forms both familiar and utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. As we continue our olfactory journey through the Middle Ages, let's get uncomfortably close to the daily hygiene practices of our ancestors. I want you to imagine waking up in a medieval dwelling, perhaps a humble peasant's cottage or a stone chamber in a noble's castle. The morning light filters through small windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Your body feels sticky with the night's sweat. Your mouth tastes like something small and furry, dyed in it, and various regions of your anatomy are crying out for attention. What do you do in this world without bathrooms, running water, or anything resembling toothpaste? First things first, the morning face wash. Across all social classes, washing one's face and hands upon rising was standard practice. A basin of water, likely cold, unless you were wealthy enough to have servants prepare warm water, would be your first encounter with cleanliness for the day. This wasn't just about removing dirt. It was a ritual that marked the transition from sleep to wakefulness, from private to public life. For the common folk, this water might come from a nearby well or stream, hauled in buckets and used sparingly. The wealthy might have servants bring freshly drawn water to their chambers, perhaps even warmed slightly for comfort. Either way, the principle was the same: cupped hands, water splashed on the face, a moment of bracing alertness as sleep falls away. After the face and hands, attention might turn to the mouth. The medieval equivalent of brushing your teeth was far from our minty fresh experience, but it wasn't completely ignored either. A common practice involved rubbing the teeth with a rough cloth, sometimes dipped in salt or various herbal mixtures. Some hygiene manuals recommended rubbing the teeth with green hazel branches, their ends chewed into a sort of primitive brush. Imagine the texture of gnawed wood against your morning teeth, not exactly the gentle bristles of your modern toothbrush. Other dental cleaning agents included sage, rosemary, and even crushed charcoal mixed with honey. These weren't just chosen for cleaning power, they served as breath fresheners too. Medieval people were acutely aware of halitosis and considered bad breath not just unpleasant, but potentially a sign of internal corruption or disease. Medical treatises of the time linked mouth odors to stomach ailments and imbalanced humors, creating a connection between breath and internal health that wasn't entirely misguided. After attending to the face, hands, and mouth, our medieval riser would need to address the rest of the body. Here's where class differences become particularly stark. For the wealthy, a servant might bring a shallow basin of warm water and cloths for a more thorough washing. Key areas, what were delicately called the 4 points of courtesy, hands, face, feet, and genitals, would receive attention, while the rest of the body remained largely untouched by water. The use of a small cloth or sponge dipped in water constituted what we might recognize as a sponge bath, focusing on areas most likely to produce odor or visible dirt. This approach made efficient use of limited water while addressing the most pressing hygiene needs. If you've ever used those disposable bathing wipes during a camping trip or hospital stay, you're experiencing a modern version of this medieval practice. For the less fortunate, even this limited washing might be constrained by practical realities. Water had to be hauled from its source, taking time and energy better spent on essential labor. In winter, washing with cold water was an exercise in fortitude that many likely minimized, yet even the poorest peasant would make some effort to clean face and hands before joining others, particularly before attending church or community gatherings. The truly wealthy might occasionally indulge in more elaborate morning toilettes. Imagine a noble woman, attended by ladies-in-waiting, having her face washed with herb-infused waters, her hands cleaned and softened with almond paste, her hair carefully combed and arranged. These rituals weren't just about cleanliness, they were performances of status, displays of the leisure time and resources that separated nobility from commoners. Speaking of hair care, medieval people faced the perennial challenge of keeping their locks reasonably clean without frequent washing. Hair was typically washed much less often than in our shampoo-obsessed era, perhaps a few times a year for many people. Instead, frequent combing served as the primary hair care technique. Combs, often made of bone, wood, or ivory for the wealthy, were essential grooming tools. Combing did more than detangle. It distributed the scalp's natural oils through the hair, removed loose hairs and debris, and most importantly, helped control the inevitable lice. Yes, head lice were an almost universal experience in medieval Europe, with even the wealthiest nobles hosting these tiny tenants. The fine-toothed comb wasn't just a grooming implement, it was a weapon in the constant battle against parasites. Some particularly fastidious individuals might supplement combing with herbal hair treatments. Rosemary-infused water, applied to the hair and allowed to dry, was believed to strengthen the locks and deter pests. Various flowers and herbs steeped in water created rinses that added pleasant scents and were thought to address specific hair problems: lavender for lice, chamomile for lightening blonde hair, sage for darkening graying hair. For those with the time and resources, more elaborate hair care regimens existed. Egg whites beaten into a froth could be applied as a primitive styling product. Mixtures of wine, honey, and herbs created masks believed to strengthen and beautify the hair, but for most people, daily hair care consisted simply of thorough combing, perhaps followed by covering the hair with appropriate headgear, which conveniently concealed less than fresh locks while signaling one's social status and marital state. Beard care for men involved similar principles: combing, occasional washing with herb-infused water, and the application of scented oils or waxes for styling characterized medieval beard maintenance. A well-groomed beard signaled manhood and often social standing, while a wild, unkempt beard might mark its wearer as either unable to care for himself or deliberately rejecting social norms, as with certain religious ascetics. Now, let's address the elephant in the medieval room: body odor. In a world without antiperspirants, daily showers, or washing machines, how did people cope with the inevitable human smells? The answer lies partly in their different relationship with natural body odors. Simply put, the threshold for what constituted offensive odor was much higher than ours. When everyone shares a similar baseline of bodily sense, they become far less noticeable or objectionable. That said, medieval people weren't oblivious to particularly strong odors. Various strategies existed for managing them, particularly for those in higher social circles, where such matters carried more significance. Changing linen undergarments was the first line of defense. These garments, worn directly against the skin, absorbed sweat and oils. A wealthy person might change these linens daily, while those less fortunate might manage weekly changes at best. Beyond linen, the application of scented materials offered another way to mask body odors. Sachets of dried herbs and flowers could be tucked into clothing. Pomander balls of scented substances like ambergris, musk, or cloves, encased in perforated metal containers, might be carried or worn by the wealthy. These didn't eliminate odors, but overlaid them with more pleasant scents, creating an olfactory landscape quite different from our own. For special occasions, more elaborate preparations might be undertaken. Records tell of nobles bathing in herb-infused waters before important events like weddings or ceremonies. These baths weren't just about cleanliness, they were sensory experiences, with the water perfumed with costly imported spices and flowers that signified wealth as much as they provided pleasant aromas. The use of perfumes and scented waters expanded significantly in the later Middle Ages, initially restricted to the very wealthy due to the cost of imported ingredients. Scented products gradually became more accessible, though still luxuries by modern standards. Rose water, lavender water, and various herbal distillations could be applied to the body or clothing to impart pleasant fragrances. Let's not forget the complexities of dealing with menstruation in a world without commercial feminine hygiene products. Medieval women used rags made from scrap linen or wool, folded and placed to absorb menstrual flow. These were washed and reused, a practice not so different from modern reusable cloth pads. For those who could afford it, soft moss might also serve as an absorbent material. Managing these needs required practical understanding, passed down from mother to daughter, with little written record due to social taboos surrounding such intimate matters. While we're addressing intimate hygiene, it's worth noting that medieval people did recognize the importance of cleaning the genital and anal areas, even if their methods differ from our modern expectations. Wiping after defecation might involve moss, leaves, hay, or cloth for the wealthy. Water washing of the genital area was recommended in various medical and hygiene texts, particularly after sexual activity or menstruation. For monks and nuns, whose lives were governed by detailed rules, hygiene practices took on additional spiritual dimensions. The rule of Saint Benedict established guidelines that influenced monastic hygiene throughout medieval Europe. Regular hand washing was prescribed before meals and after certain tasks. Bathing was permitted, but with moderation that reflected the monastic values of simplicity and self-denial. In monasteries, communal washing facilities typically provided basins, for hand and face washing. More complete bathing might occur in designated areas with provisions for modesty. Monks would bathe while wearing simple garments, preserving their vow of chastity by avoiding nudity. The frequency of these more complete baths varied widely between orders and time periods, with some communities prescribing monthly bathing and others far less frequently. The sick received special consideration in monastic hygiene rules. Illness suspended the usual restrictions on bodily comforts, allowing more frequent bathing and other hygienic measures as part of medical care. This practical approach recognized that physical needs changed with health status, and that care for the sick body was an expression of Christian charity rather than indulgence. For traveling individuals, maintaining hygiene presented additional challenges. A medieval traveler might carry a small cloth for washing, seeking out streams or wells along their route. Inns sometimes provided washing basins, though the quality and cleanliness varied widely. Pilgrims journeying to holy sites might encounter hospices that offered basic washing facilities as part of their charitable services. Soldiers on campaign developed their own practical approaches to fieldcraft hygiene. Military manuals advised commanders to establish camps near clean water sources when possible. Individual soldiers might carry small combs and cloths for basic grooming. The realities of campaign life often resulted in compromised standards, but military discipline recognized that completely abandoned hygiene led to disease and reduced fighting effectiveness. As we approach the middle of our medieval hygiene odyssey, it's worth considering how deeply intertwined cleanliness was with social status. The ability to present oneself with clean hands, face, and clothing signaled not just personal habits but economic standing. A merchant or artisan might invest considerable effort in maintaining appearances that supported their business reputation. A noble appearing in public with dirty fingernails or unkempt hair would risk social censure and loss of dignity. This status dimension explains why even those of modest means would prioritize certain visible aspects of hygiene: clean hands and face, neatly arranged hair, and presentable outer garments mattered for social functioning across all classes. The less visible parts of the body might receive far less attention, creating a hygiene practice focused on public presentation rather than comprehensive cleanliness as we understand it today. Seasonal variations also shaped medieval hygiene practices. Summer heat brought increased sweating and odor, potentially prompting more frequent washing of exposed skin and changing of linen undergarments for those who could afford it. The abundance of flowers and herbs in summer also provided more materials for scenting and freshening living spaces and clothing. Winter presented different challenges. Cold made water washing uncomfortable, and heating water required precious fuel better used for cooking and warming living spaces. Winter hygiene might shift toward dry methods, more frequent changing of linens, if possible, use of scented sachets, and reliance on herbs believed to purify the air in enclosed living spaces. For many medieval people, certain life events prompted more thorough bathing. Marriage ceremonies often included ritual baths for both bride and groom, symbolizing purification and preparation for their new life together. Children was typically followed by a period of recovery that included special bathing rituals for the mother. These practices connected physical cleansing with major life transitions, giving hygiene a significance beyond mere practicality. The medieval hospital, primarily a charitable institution for the poor and ill, rather than a medical facility in the modern sense, developed its own hygiene protocols. When patients arrived, they might have their hair cut short to reduce lice, be given a basic washing, and provided with clean garments. These measures were as much about dignity and charity as they were about health, reflecting the religious motivations behind most medieval hospitals. Barbers, who offered multiple services beyond haircuts, played a role in personal hygiene. A visit to the barber might include beard trimming, hair cutting, ear cleaning, and even removal of problematic teeth. For the urban medieval person of modest means, the barber's shop provided access to hygiene services that were difficult to manage alone. The medieval marketplace offered various hygiene products for those who could afford them. Combs, small mirrors, tweezers for removing splinters or unwanted hair, and simple manicure tools could be purchased from specialized craftsmen. Soaps made from animal fats and lye were available, though used more commonly for laundry than personal washing. Herb sellers provided ingredients for everything from breath fresheners to hair rinsers. As we draw this segment to a close, I'd like to emphasize again that medieval hygiene wasn't simply a less effective version of our modern practices. It was a coherent system that made sense within its cultural and practical context. With limited access to water, different understandings of disease, and materials and technologies far removed from our own, medieval people developed creative approaches to maintaining what they considered appropriate cleanliness. The focus on visible cleanliness, hands, face, and clothing, reflected a society where public presentation carried enormous weight. The use of linens to absorb body oils and sweat represented a practical adaptation to water scarcity. The interconnection of physical and spiritual cleanliness created meaning beyond mere sanitation. These weren't failed attempts at modern hygiene. They were sophisticated responses to particular challenges and cultural values. As we transition to our next segment, where we'll explore the truly horrifying world of medieval dental practices and waste management, I invite you to reflect on how your own hygiene practices might appear to someone from another time and place. Our daily showers, obsession with eliminating all body odors, and vast array of specialized products might seem as bizarre to a medieval person as their linen-based, water-sparse approach seems to us. Now we arrive at perhaps the most visceral, most intimate aspects of medieval hygiene, the parts that modern sensibilities find most disturbing. I'm talking, of course, about oral hygiene and human waste management. These basic bodily functions, which we modern folks have sequestered into private, specialized spaces with porcelain fixtures and pleasant scents, were handled quite differently in the medieval world. So settle in, but perhaps not while eating, as we explore medieval mouths and medieval waste. Let's start with teeth, those small calcium structures that reveal so much about diet, health, and social practices. The medieval mouth was, to put it gently, a battleground. Without modern dentistry, fluoride, or even basic understanding of dental caries, teeth deteriorated in ways we'd find shocking today. Yet medieval people weren't entirely passive in the face of this dental assault. They developed various approaches to maintaining oral hygiene, some surprisingly effective and others less so. As mentioned earlier, the cloth rub was a common method for cleaning teeth. Imagine taking a small piece of linen, perhaps dampened with water or wine, and vigorously rubbing it across your teeth. The abrasion removed some food particles and surface stains, though it couldn't address deeper problems. For added cleaning power, this cloth might be dipped in salt, which served as an abrasive agent, not entirely unlike modern toothpaste. Tooth powders existed as well, made from crushed herbs, minerals, and sometimes downright alarming ingredients. A 14th century recipe called for burnt salt, burnt bread, and sage, all ground into a powder and applied to the teeth. Other formulations included crushed cuttlefish bone, pepper, and even powdered mouse head. Yes, you read that correctly. These concoctions were rubbed onto the teeth with the fingers or a cloth. Toothpicks were ubiquitous across all social classes, made from wood, metal, or even porcupine quills for the fancy folk. Toothpicks were used at the table, without our modern sense of impropriety. Etiquette guides advised using one hand to shield the mouth while picking, but the act itself was perfectly acceptable public behavior. Medieval illustrations often show diners casually picking their teeth while continuing conversation. For those with means, more elaborate tools existed. Small silver or gold implements, combining a toothpick at one end with an ear scoop at the other, have been found in archaeological contexts, sometimes attached to decorative chains worn as accessories. These multi-purpose grooming tools suggest that certain aspects of personal hygiene were not merely private necessities, but social performances, demonstrating refinement and wealth. Mouthwashes and breath fresheners played a significant role in medieval oral hygiene. Wine, particularly white wine, served as a common mouthwash. Various herbs steeped in wine or water created rinses believed to strengthen gums and sweeten breath. Chewing fresh herbs like mint, parsley, or fennel provided temporary breath freshening. For those with real halitosis issues, stronger concoctions involving myrrh, cinnamon, or cloves might be recommended. Despite these efforts, dental problems were nearly universal. Tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss affected people across all social classes, though diet created significant differences in severity. The wealthy, with access to more refined foods and sugar, increasingly available in the later Middle Ages, often suffered worse dental outcomes than peasants eating coarser, less processed foods. The abrasiveness of medieval bread, containing small particles of stone from the milling process, actually provided a side benefit of wearing down teeth evenly, rather than creating cavities, a dental advantage the poor had over the rich. When dental problems became severe enough to cause unbearable pain, medieval people turned to extraction. Without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium derivatives, for the fortunate, tooth pulling was a traumatic experience typically performed by barbers or specialized tooth drawers. The procedure involved pliers-like instruments yanking the offending tooth while assistants held down the patient. Not surprisingly, many people endured dental pain for years rather than face this ordeal. Folk remedies for toothache abounded, ranging from the relatively sensible clove oil applied to the painful tooth, to the bizarre writing charms on parchment and wearing them around the neck. One recommended treatment involved capturing a live frog, tying it against the cheek nearest the aching tooth, and leaving it there until either the pain subsided or the frog died. One imagines neither the patient nor the frog found this arrangement satisfactory. For those wealthy enough to lose teeth and maintain social standing, primitive forms of prosthetic dentistry existed. Replacement teeth might be carved from bone or ivory, or in some cases, actual human teeth might be purchased or harvested from less fortunate individuals and attached to adjacent teeth with gold wire. These solutions were cosmetic rather than functional, aimed at preserving appearance rather than chewing ability. By the end of the medieval period, some specialized dental practitioners had emerged, though true dentistry as a profession wouldn't develop until much later. These practitioners offered services beyond simple extractions, including lancing gum abscesses, filing down uneven teeth, and even attempting to fill cavities with lead or gold for the very wealthy. The success of these procedures varied widely, and infection remained a serious risk. Now, with that unpleasantness explored, let's move to an even more visceral aspect of medieval hygiene, the management of human waste. Here, perhaps more than anywhere else, we find medieval practices most alien to our modern sensibilities. Without indoor plumbing, sewage systems, or even the concept of waste treatment, medieval people developed various approaches to the universal human need to eliminate bodily waste. For those living in rural settings, the majority of the population, the solutions were relatively straightforward. Nature provided ample opportunity to relieve oneself away from living spaces. Fields, woods, and other open areas served as improvised toilets, with people simply squatting and then covering their waste with a bit of dirt if they were particularly considerate. The popular modern image of peasants defecating openly near their homes significantly oversimplifies and often misrepresents medieval rural waste management. In more densely populated areas like towns and cities, the challenges of waste disposal became more complex. The simplest solution was the chamber pot, a ceramic or metal vessel kept in the bedroom for nighttime use or during inclement weather. These pots required emptying, of course, which typically meant disposing of the contents in the nearest convenient location. In many towns, this meant tossing the waste into the street, where rain was expected to wash it toward the nearest waterway. This practice gave rise to the infamous cry of gardez-l'eau, watch out for the water, or simply gardez-l'eau, a warning shouted before emptying a chamber pot from an upper-story window. The prudent medieval pedestrian learned to walk close to building walls rather than in the center of the street, and to keep alert for these warnings. Despite regulations in many towns forbidding this practice during daylight hours or requiring waste to be carried to designated dumping sites, the convenience of the window disposal method ensured its persistence. For those of higher status, more sophisticated arrangements existed. Castles and manor houses often featured garderobes, small rooms projecting from the main structure with a seat positioned over an opening. These privy chambers disposed of waste directly outside the building, either into a cesspit that required periodic emptying, or, ideally, into a moat or waterway that carried the waste away. The word garderobe literally means clothes protector, as these rooms often doubled as storage spaces for valuable garments, the ammonia from urine supposedly deterring moths and other pests. Monasteries, with their large permanent communities, developed some of the most sophisticated medieval waste systems. Many featured communal latrines, positioned over running water when possible, allowing waste to be carried away rather than accumulating. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that monks should have access to privies day and night, recognizing this basic physical need. Some larger monasteries even had primitive sewage systems, with channels directing wastewater away from living quarters. Public facilities existed in many medieval towns, though such facility may suggest more infrastructure than actually existed. These ranged from simple designated areas along streams or rivers to more elaborate structures with multiple seats positioned over waterways or cesspits. Privacy was minimal by our standards. These were social spaces where people might engage in conversation while attending to bodily functions. Some public privies charged a small fee for use, while others were maintained as a public service. For those unable or unwilling to access proper facilities, street urination and defecation remained commonplace, particularly in poorer urban areas. Municipal authorities struggled constantly with the resulting sanitation issues, passing ordinances that were difficult to enforce. Some towns employed muckrakers to clear animal and human waste from streets, while others relied on rain, pigs, who would eat almost anything, and the passage of cartwheels to manage the problem. The material used for wiping deserves special attention, as it highlights the resourcefulness of medieval people facing daily necessities without our disposable products. Wealthy individuals might use scraps of linen or wool cloth, which could be washed and reused. The less fortunate turned to whatever was available. Handfuls of straw, moss, leaves, or even smooth stones. Water washing after defecation was also practiced, particularly in higher status households where water was more accessible. In a particularly medieval intersection of practical need and spiritual practice, waste management sometimes utilized scraps of parchment with religious writings that contained errors, rather than discard holy words improperly. These imperfect texts found their final use in the privy. One can only imagine the theological discussions this practice might have inspired. The combination of rudimentary waste disposal systems and limited understanding of disease transmission created serious public health issues, particularly in urban environments. Wells and water sources often became contaminated by nearby cesspits or waste dumping. During rainy periods, streets turned into foul-smelling rivers, carrying a mixture of animal and human waste. The connection between these conditions and disease outbreaks was recognized only in the most general terms, with bad smells thought to be the disease vector rather than the contamination itself. By the later Middle Ages, some cities had begun implementing more systematic approaches to waste management. Paris, for example, required cesspits to be lined with stone or wood to prevent leakage into surrounding soil. London established regulations for gong farmers who emptied cesspits, specifying that waste needed to be transported out of the city rather than dumped in the Thames, though compliance remained spotty at best. The sensory experience of medieval waste management deserves consideration beyond just the mechanics. Our modern world has effectively deodorized bodily functions through plumbing, ventilation, and scented products. The medieval world embraced no such illusions. The smells of human waste were part of the olfactory landscape, particularly in towns and cities during summer months. This wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. Similar conditions persisted well into the 19th century in many European cities, but it represents a sensory reality almost unimaginable to modern people. How did medieval people cope with these odors? To some extent, they simply grew accustomed to them. Their olfactory thresholds adjusted to their environment, but they also employed various strategies to create more pleasant scent environments, particularly in indoor spaces. Strewing herbs like lavender, meadowsweet, or rushes on floors absorb some odors while releasing more pleasant scents when crushed underfoot. Burning incense, particularly in churches and wealthy households, created pockets of aromatic space amid less pleasant urban odors. The medieval nose was attuned to subtleties our sanitized senses might miss. Medical theory held that smells carried health consequences. Certain odors were believed to transmit disease, while others protected against it. During plague outbreaks, people carried pomanders and nosegays, believing these pleasant scents would ward off illness. While their understanding of disease transmission was flawed, the cultural significance of managing one's olfactory environment was profound. As we near the end of this segment on medieval teeth and toilets, let's consider how these most basic aspects of physical existence connected to broader social and cultural patterns. The management of bodily functions reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. A noble with a private garderobe, herb-scented breath, and servants to empty their chamber pots experienced bodily necessities very differently from a town dweller sharing a public privy or a peasant seeking privacy behind a hedgerow. Yet across these divisions ran the common thread of human embodiment. Medieval people, from the highest king to the lowest servant, inhabited bodies with the same fundamental needs and processes. The elaborations of status occurred within this shared bodily reality, creating systems that acknowledged our common humanity while simultaneously marking its social distinctions. The medieval approach to bodies and their functions was, in many ways, more direct than our own. Without our modern layers of technological mediation, medieval people maintained a certain intimacy with bodily processes we've sanitized almost out of existence. There's something to be learned from this directness, even as we appreciate our modern plumbing and dental care. As we draw this segment to a close and prepare to explore the social dimensions of medieval hygiene in our final section, I invite you to consider how profoundly our relationship with our own bodies is shaped by our technological and cultural context. The medieval person managing their oral hygiene with a cloth and some salt, or seeking a private moment in the castle garderobe, wasn't simply a less advanced version of ourselves. They were navigating their embodied existence with the tools and understandings available to them, just as we do today. As we enter the final segment of our malodorous journey through medieval hygiene, let's step back to consider the broader social meanings of cleanliness and uncleanliness. For medieval people, hygiene wasn't simply about removing dirt or preventing disease, concepts that dominate our modern understanding. Rather, it functioned as a complex system of social signaling, moral expression, and practical compromise with the material realities of their world. To begin, let's explore the substance that seems most conspicuously absent from medieval hygiene practices: soap. While soap existed throughout the medieval period, its use and production differed significantly from our modern experience. Medieval soap was primarily created through a process that combined animal fats with lye derived from wood ashes. The resulting product was harsh, caustic, and far from the gentle, fragrant bars we use today. Soap production was a specialized trade, often located at town outskirts due to the unpleasant smells it generated and its high fire risk. Soap makers or saponifiers held modest social status, their trade necessary but hardly glamorous. The process required rendering animal fat, often from sheep or cattle, though cheaper soaps might use less desirable fat sources, then boiling this with lye in large cauldrons. The mixture was then allowed to cure, sometimes for months, before being cut into rough blocks for sale. The resulting soap varied widely in quality. High-end soaps might incorporate olive oil rather than animal fat, producing a milder product suitable for washing delicate fabrics or even bodies. Some luxury soaps included herbs, flowers, or imported spices to impart pleasant scents and supposed medicinal benefits. At the lower end, crude soaps made from questionable fats produced harsh, strong-smelling products primarily used for laundry and household cleaning rather than personal hygiene. Significantly, soap was used far more commonly for washing textiles than for washing bodies. The medieval relationship with soap reflects their broader hygiene paradigm. Cleanliness of garments, particularly those visible to others, took precedence over skin cleansing. A person of means might never apply soap directly to their skin, yet spend considerable resources ensuring their linens and outer garments were properly cleaned with soap. This brings us to the central role of laundry in medieval hygiene systems. In a world where full-body washing was infrequent, the cleanliness of clothing, especially undergarments, served as the primary interface between the body and the social world. Laundering was hard, physical work, typically performed by women, either as household duties or as specialized laundresses serving wealthy households or urban clientele. The laundry process itself was labor-intensive and harsh on both fabrics and hands. Linens would be soaked, sometimes overnight, then treated with soap or other cleaning agents like fuller's earth, a type of clay. The actual cleaning involved beating the wet textiles with wooden paddles or against rocks, rinsing multiple times, wringing out excess water, and finally drying, ideally in sunshine, which provided natural bleaching and disinfection. For the wealthy, whose garments might include delicate dyes and expensive materials, specialized knowledge of how to clean without damaging was essential. In urban settings, professional laundresses worked communally at designated washing places, often along riverbanks. These became important social spaces for women, combining essential labor with opportunities for conversation and community building. They were also sites of technological innovation, as laundresses developed specialized tools and techniques to improve efficiency and results. The economics of clean clothing created sharp distinctions between social classes. A wealthy merchant or noble might maintain multiple sets of linen undergarments, allowing frequent changes. The outer garments, more expensive and difficult to clean, might remain unwashed for extended periods, but would be protected by these renewable layers of linen. In contrast, a poor laborer might possess only one or two sets of undergarments, limiting the frequency of changes regardless of desire for cleanliness. Beyond practical cleaning, clothing hygiene involved managing inevitable parasites, primarily lice and fleas, which affected people across all social classes. Regular combing with fine-tooth combs removed some lice and their eggs. Clothing might be boiled when possible, though this was impractical for many garment types. Herbs like lavender, pennyroyal, and wormwood were tucked into clothing storage, their strong scents believed to repel insects. For the wealthy, fur garments presented particular challenges. These expensive status symbols provided warmth and visual luxury, but also offered ideal environments for parasites. Records describe elaborate procedures for maintaining furs, including beating them with special rods, fumigating with herbs, and storing with appropriate repellents. Despite these efforts, contemporary accounts suggest that even the most elegant fur-clad nobles were rarely parasite-free. The presence of parasites was so universal that it generated its own cultural and social practices. Intimate delousing, removing lice from another person's hair or clothing, could be an expression of care between family members or close friends. Medical texts discussed various treatments for lice infestations, from herbal remedies to mercury compounds, which were toxic but effective. Religious houses, particularly those housing children or serving the poor, developed routine delousing protocols as part of their charitable mission. The medieval approach to parasites reflected their broader attitude toward bodily discomforts, acceptance of inevitable hardships combined with practical mitigation strategies. Rather than expecting complete elimination of lice or fleas, an impossible standard in their technological context, they focused on managing populations to tolerable levels and treating the worst effects like excessive itching or secondary infections. Religious institutions played a complex role in shaping medieval hygiene practices. On one hand, Christian theology emphasized the spiritual over the physical, sometimes treating bodily concerns as distractions from higher pursuits. Some ascetic traditions even portrayed deliberate neglect of bodily cleanliness as virtuous self-denial. Saint Jerome famously praised the desert hermit, Saint Hilarion, for never washing his sackcloth garment, saying that it was superfluous to look for cleanliness in a hair shirt. On the other hand, monastic rules typically included practical hygiene requirements. The Benedictine rule prescribed regular hand washing before meals, care for the sick, including appropriate bathing, and maintenance of communal facilities, including latrines. These practical regulations recognized that communal living required basic sanitation standards, regardless of individual spiritual aspirations. The Church's attitude toward bathing evolved significantly throughout the medieval period. Early Christian writers, influenced by Roman bathing culture, generally accepted bathing as a neutral practice that could serve health and cleanliness. By the later Middle Ages, ecclesiastical authorities expressed increasing suspicion toward communal bathing facilities, viewing them as sites of potential moral corruption. One 15th-century German bishop prohibited his clergy from visiting bathhouses, calling them places of shameful practices and seductions. This moral concern centered particularly on mixed-gender bathing, which persisted in many regions despite periodic attempts at regulation. Church authorities worried about the inevitable sexual temptations arising from nudity and physical proximity, yet their repeated prohibitions suggest these practices continued regardless, indicating a gap between official moral standards and practical social realities. The complex relationship between religion and hygiene extended to the concept of spiritual cleanliness. Medieval Christianity emphasized interior purity over exterior cleanliness, creating a conceptual framework where a physically dirty body might house a clean soul, while an immaculately groomed person might conceal spiritual corruption. This dichotomy appears frequently in literature and art, where saints might appear disheveled yet radiate inner light, while elegantly presented courtiers harbor dark secrets. However, this spiritual/physical distinction wasn't absolute. Many religious traditions incorporated physical washing as symbolic preparation for spiritual activities. Washing hands before prayer, ritual bathing before important religious ceremonies, and the purification of women after childbirth all connected physical cleanliness with spiritual readiness. Baptism itself, the central Christian initiation ritual, employs water washing as both physical act and spiritual symbol. Medical understandings significantly influenced medieval hygiene practices. The dominant Galenic medical theory, based on balancing the four bodily humors, viewed health as a state of equilibrium that could be disturbed by external factors, including bathing practices. Hot baths were thought to open the skin's pores, making the body vulnerable to harmful miasmas, bad air, that could cause disease. Cold baths presented different risks, potentially shocking the system and disrupting humoral balance. These medical concerns created a complicated relationship with bathing that changed significantly during plague outbreaks. Following the Black Death of the mid-14th century, medical authorities increasingly warned against hot baths, believing they created dangerous vulnerability to infection. This medical perspective reinforce religious concerns about bathhouses, creating a powerful combined resistance to communal bathing practices. Instead, medical texts recommended selective washing, the hands and face for general cleanliness, specific body parts as needed for particular complaints. Full immersion became increasingly medicalized, prescribed for specific conditions rather than general hygiene. Hot baths might be recommended for joint pain, cold baths for certain fevers, mineral baths for skin conditions, each with careful attention to timing, temperature, and duration to avoid disrupting humoral balance. For women, hygiene practices intersected with complex beliefs about reproductive health. Medical texts prescribe specific washing regimens before and after menstruation, during pregnancy, and following childbirth. These recommendations blended practical sanitation with theories about female physiology that we now know were largely incorrect. Still, they created structured approaches to female bodily care that acknowledged women's specific hygiene needs. Childbirth generated particularly elaborate hygiene rituals. After delivery, a woman would typically undergo a period of convalescence, during which special attention was paid to cleansing and healing. Various herbal baths, vaginal fumigations, and applied poultices address physical recovery, while also carrying symbolic significance of purification. This postpartum period culminated in the ceremony of churching, a religious blessing that marked the mother's return to full participation in community life. Medieval beauty practices often intersected with hygiene in ways that blur our modern categories. Skincare, for instance, involved both cleansing and cosmetic elements. Women of means might use almond paste, rose water, and white lead, a toxic but effective whitening agent, to create the pale, smooth complexion considered beautiful. Men's grooming incorporated beard oils that both styled and fragrant, while hair care included both cleaning and styling functions. These beauty practices reflected social ideals that varied significantly by time, region, and class. Throughout most of the medieval period, the aristocratic beauty standard emphasized pale skin for women, indicating indoor leisure rather than outdoor labor, clear complexion, and carefully managed hair. For men, well-maintained beards or clean-shaven faces, depending on current fashion, signaled attention to appearance appropriate to social position. Cosmetics use was controversial, particularly among religious authorities, who viewed artificial enhancement of appearance as a form of deception. Yet evidence from household accounts, medical texts, and artwork confirms that cosmetic preparations from simple herb-infused waters to complex mixtures containing expensive imported ingredients were widely used by those who could afford them. For the medieval urban dweller, maintenance of personal hygiene occurred against a backdrop of challenging environmental conditions. Cities and towns were crowded, with limited infrastructure for waste removal or clean water supply. Streets often served as default dumping grounds for household waste, creating conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Municipal authorities attempted to address these challenges through various regulations. Many towns required residents to clean the street in front of their property, prohibited certain waste disposal practices during daylight hours, and established designated dumping areas outside city walls. Enforcement varied widely, but these regulations indicate recognition of public hygiene as a civic concern rather than purely individual responsibility. Water supply infrastructure varied dramatically in quality and quantity. Some cities maintained sophisticated systems inherited from Roman times, with aqueducts bringing fresh water to public fountains. Others relied on wells, rivers, or streams of questionable purity. Access to clean water directly impacted hygiene possibilities, creating geographic disparities in cleanliness practices independent of cultural or religious factors. Wealthy urban households sometimes created private hygiene oases amidst public squalor. A prosperous merchant might maintain a private well, bathing chamber, and waste disposal arrangements, while just outside, public streets remained filthy. This privatization of hygiene infrastructure reinforced social distinctions, while creating pockets of relative cleanliness within otherwise challenging urban environments. For rural dwellers, different challenges shaped hygiene practices. While they typically had better access to clean water sources and space for waste disposal, they faced limitations in heating fuel, specialized products, and sometimes even basic soap. Agricultural work involved inevitable dirt and animal contact, creating different cleanliness expectations and routines. The rhythm of rural hygiene often followed seasonal patterns, winter minimizing washing due to cold, summer allowing more frequent cleaning, but also generating more sweat and dirt. As we approach the end of our exploration, it's worth considering how medieval people themselves understood and evaluated cleanliness. Their standards weren't simply less stringent versions of our own. They operated within an entirely different conceptual framework. Clean meant different things in different contexts, with shifting emphasis on visible dirt, odor, symbolic purity, and moral dimensions. For the medieval person, cleanliness was often more about appearance and scent than bacterial removal, a concept they couldn't have understood. Clean hands, face, and visible garments signaled respect for social norms. Pleasant or neutral body odor, rather than the complete absence of odor we now expect, indicated adequate personal management. Clean linen against the skin represented proper hygiene, regardless of when water last touched the body itself. This different conceptualization explains practices that might seem contradictory to us, like a noble who rarely immersed in water, yet changed linen shirts daily, and applied perfumed oils to mask body odor. From within their conceptual framework, this person was practicing good hygiene, maintaining social standards, and managing bodily realities within practical constraints. The transition from medieval to early modern hygiene practices wasn't abrupt, but evolutionary, with significant regional variations. By the 16th century, printed hygiene manuals began circulating among literate populations, standardizing expectations among the upper classes. New products and technologies gradually modified practices, the spread of cotton textiles, improvements in soap production, and eventually the development of indoor plumbing. Yet many medieval approaches to cleanliness persisted well into the 19th century. The linen-focused hygiene system, emphasis on visible cleanliness, and suspicion of complete immersion continued long after the Middle Ages officially ended. Even today, traces of medieval thinking persist in our language and concepts. We still talk about freshening up rather than truly cleaning when we perform quick, appearance-focused hygiene rituals. As we conclude our exploration of medieval hygiene, perhaps we can appreciate both the vast differences and surprising similarities between their world and ours. Medieval people, like us, sought to manage their physical bodies within social norms. Using available technologies and knowledge, they developed sophisticated systems that made sense within their cultural context, even if those systems seem foreign to our sensibilities. The next time you step into your shower, encounter a public restroom, or reach for that minty toothpaste, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Their world filled with chamber pots, herb-scented linens, and spiritual connections to physical cleanliness was not simply a dirtier version of our own, but a completely different way of understanding and managing the inescapable realities of embodied human existence. With that reflection, I'll leave you to drift towards sleep, perhaps with a new appreciation for your modern bathroom and the luxury of cleanliness it represents, or perhaps with vivid dreams of medieval streets where the cry of Garde l'eau sends pedestrians scurrying for cover as window shutters swing open above,